name's Dr. Allison Stiles. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I work at the University of Rochester Medical Center as a senior instructor. And I also work with several of the school districts through our expanded school mental health program, and have experience as well with behavioral health support in primary care clinics. I actually grew up here in Rochester, New York, and I received a BA at Bates College and then a PhD at the University of Denver in child clinical psychology, and then moved back here to Rochester to finish up my fellowship year at UR Medicine, and I've stayed on here as faculty, as I mentioned. A fun fact about me is that I also am certified as an elementary education teacher and taught fifth grade for a couple of years in New Mexico before I moved back into the field of psychology. And in addition to those roles, I'm also a mom, which, as you all know, because you're here, parenting is a full-time job as well. And so I'm excited to be here to talk with you all. So briefly, what will we be discussing today? So we'll be talking about what school anxiety, school avoidance is, how to recognize school avoidance, and how to understand a little bit about why my child might be avoiding school. We're also going to spend some time thinking about what, as parents, can we do to help with school avoidance when it does come up. And lastly, thinking about, how do we know when we might need some extra support and what support is available for us. So starting first with thinking about what is school avoidance or school refusal. You'll notice that I'm using school avoidance and school refusal interchangeably, those two terms today, by the way. So when we're thinking about school avoidance, this is really a consistent pattern of resistance or refusal to go to school or to stay in school, due at least in part to anxiety or mood challenges. And so this might involve things like avoiding school altogether, regularly missing school or coming in late, frequent trips to the nurse's office or the counseling office, or just battles to get out the door every single morning, leading to getting to school late. And you'll notice as we're talking about this that it's important to think about how this really presents itself along a spectrum, right? So there's on one end of the spectrum, we have students who are maybe attending school but experience significant distress around getting to school. They might engage in behaviors to avoid getting out the door in the morning, kind of delaying that process of getting on the bus or driving to school, leading to late arrivals. Sort of in the middle of that spectrum, we start to see that maybe students are skipping class or are repeatedly missing full days of school. And then on the far end of the spectrum, we have students who are completely absent for a certain period of time or for a prolonged period of time. So how common are these challenges? It's estimated that about 8 to 28% of youth experience school avoidance or refusal behaviors. But because you can imagine from hearing about this sort of spectrum of behaviors that we were discussing, it can be pretty challenging to really fully quantify the prevalence. And given the increase in stress and mental health challenges among youth during COVID-19, these numbers are likely an underestimation of the true rates of school avoidance challenges that youth are facing. So when we look at who is experiencing school avoidance, we see similar rates across gender, race, income level. We know that challenges with school avoidance are frequently anxiety-based, and for teens, it's often anxiety and mood disorders that are comorbid. I also want to note here that what we'll be talking about tonight with school avoidance, we are not talking about the same thing as skipping school or truancy, as many of you, I'm sure, that are here tonight would recognize, right? This is something different, although there can be overlap, but this is something that's more focused on an anxiety-based type of challenge. So school anxiety or school refusal can seem to kind of pop up unexpectedly. But there are actually a number of factors that increase the likelihood of a child exhibiting school avoidance behaviors. So most common ages when we might see school avoidance start to pop up are around transition times. So starting in a new building or a new school, we see this typically around that 5, 6-year-old range when we're starting kindergarten, or around 11 to 13 when we're transitioning into middle school. Those are two common times when we might see this pop up. School avoidance also is likely to emerge following school breaks, so a vacation or a holiday, being out sick, or even coming back from the weekend. We might start to see some of these behaviors pop up. And in some ways that makes sense, right? So for kids where there might be some challenges with school avoidance or with anxiety around school, when we aren't there, we have this sort of what we call a cold pool experience, right? So if we jump into a cold swimming pool after being out in the hot sun, it's a huge shock, right? So similarly, the first day back at school can be hard for some kids. It can be a shock. And each hour that they're there, or each day that they're there, they become more comfortable, more adjusted to that water temperature, right? But those transitions can be difficult. Certain life stressors can also trigger school refusal behaviors, although not always. So for example, moving to a new home or a new school district, major life events within the family, medical difficulties, or exposure to a trauma or a stressor could all trigger school refusal challenges. Factors at school can also play a role in school avoidance or anxiety. So if there are negative interactions with peers or staff, if they're not feeling connected or safe in their school, or if they're having challenges academically. And then lastly, in case anybody's forgotten, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so this is clearly a huge risk factor for increased school anxiety and avoidance, right? Youth have been in and out of school for the last year and a half. Many were out for quite a long time, as excused to be hybrid or remote. Many of us in returning to school, parents, students, teachers have all questioned safety concerns with return to school. Everybody's feeling anxious, right? So these are a number of stressors that are making us see this occur much more often than typical. So when we think about school avoidance, is this something that we can ignore? Is it something that just goes away on its own? Typically what we see is that this is something we do want to address and address early, because it can get worse over time. And we see that when it kind of continues to linger, those have negative effects on school performance, peer relationships, feeling connectedness. It can often increase mood or anxiety challenges and put strain on the family. The good news is, however, and what we'll spend much of today talking about, is that there are ways to turn things around, and there are ways to get support and collaboration. And kids and teens, when they have that support, they can and they do thrive. So before we jump into what that might look like, first let's think a little bit about, why do kids and teens avoid school? And it really boils down to these 4 primary functions or primary reasons for avoidance. So first, youth are avoiding perhaps because of a stimuli, because of a situation at school that's causing negative emotions. They might be avoiding because it's difficult to deal with the social complexities or evaluative situations, performance-related situations at school. Teens or kids might be seeking out adult or parental attention. Or lastly, they're being reinforced for some kind of tangible reward that's happening outside of school. And these functions really fall into 2 categories. So these first 2 are really anxiety-based functions. And the second 2 are kind of more around reward and reinforcement functions. When we think about the anxiety-based functions, right, we can think about that this is being driven by a worry about something bad happening at school, or it could be because of social anxiety. And we're talking here about situations in which there really isn't a cause for worry, right? So we're not talking about a situation in which there's bullying or other things going on, but really when there's not a typical cause for worry. That second area that we mentioned, right, is focused more on rewards. A lot of times we can accidentally reinforce kids for not going to school. So they might, that parent attention that they might be getting, even if it's negative, can be accidentally reinforcing. Or they might start to be able to do things at home that are fun, that end up rewarding staying out of school. We often see that it also can be a combination of the two. For today's talk, we'll spend a lot of time focusing in particular on the anxiety piece of things, but we'll also touch on what happens when we have that accidental reinforcement at home. So taking a moment to just overview on what anxiety is. For many of you that are joining, if you're part of this parent group, you likely already know some of this information, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? Anxiety is a general feeling about nervousness or worry. It's a normal human response, right? Everybody experiences it. And we often think about anxiety as sort of our body's alarm system. And it's a helpful alarm in many situations. It can help us study for a big test. It can help us to look both ways when we cross the street so we don't get hit by a car. It might help us to recognize larger dangers, right? But sometimes our anxiety systems can become triggered too easily. And we sort of have this false alarm that keeps going off. And that can be really difficult and really get in the way of things for people. And it can really manifest in a couple of different areas, right? So it can manifest its feelings that are then associated with behaviors and thoughts and physical symptoms. So for example, your child might be experiencing a range of feelings associated with anxiety, fear, anger, irritability. And then you might notice that child crying, tantruming, maybe they're extra clingy, maybe they're really fidgety. Or for some kids, when they feel that high anxiety, they just shut down completely. And then lastly, we're experiencing oftentimes these physical responses to anxiety. So you might notice that your child is experiencing related stomach aches or headaches. They might talk about having elevated heart rate, or have difficulties with digestion and GI issues, all of these things being linked with anxiety. And a key thing when we're experiencing these uncomfortable feelings is that anxiety really pushes us to avoid, right? This is sort of the hallmark of anxiety. It pushes us to avoid doing that thing that makes us feel anxious. And so what happens is we get stuck. We get stuck in this anxiety cycle, right? So we avoid the anxiety-provoking situation. We get this quick relief, but then the next time when we have to face that situation again, our body and our brain haven't learned that actually we can handle that situation, and that actually that feeling that we had inside, that anxiety, was a false alarm, that there wasn't danger there. And so that anxiety grows, and every time that we avoid, it gets bigger and bigger. So the number one way that we have to effectively help to decrease anxiety, a huge component of decreasing that anxiety, is that we have to learn how to face those situations, learn how to sit through them. And as we do that process, our body's physiology response goes down, right? You see that curve, it goes down eventually. And each time we do that and sit through it, that anxiety response gets smaller and smaller. And this is really important when we keep in mind when we're thinking about how do we tackle school anxiety, how do we tackle school-related avoidance. So before we get into that, school avoidance, let's pause for a second and think about this. Doesn't just happen overnight, right? It starts slowly. So maybe we notice some physical symptoms, physical complaints. Maybe our child is starting to mention having headaches often or stomach aches often. And we've gone to the doctors and there's nothing medically that's concerning, but we keep having this kind of complaints of stomach aches or headaches. You might also notice that there are frequent trips happening to maybe the guidance counselor's office or the nurse. You might start to get more regular calls home, or your child asking to leave school early. You might also start to find that you become engaged in these arguments or this bargaining with your child to just try to get them out the door in the morning. Or you're hearing them complaining about school, kind of more than normal, right? All kids complain about school, but you're hearing constant complaints. And then also you might start to notice absences on stressful days, like when there's a test or a presentation, or hear from your child about some excessive worry about your parent. And if everybody could just make sure you're on mute, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So thinking about what can parents do? We've noticed these warning signs. We see these things emerging. What can we do to help? The first thing we want to do is we actually want to think about several fundamental aspects of your child's life and make sure that these areas are being appropriately addressed. So if we really want to set ourselves up for success, we really need to check in to make sure these are on the right track. Sometimes just getting these things on the right track is all we need in order to be able to help push that process back towards getting into school. And even if we find that we need more formal support, more formal intervention, having these fundamental aspects in place is really important, and we build on that foundation with the additional interventions. So first, thinking about sleep and school attendance. School refusal behaviors and sleep difficulties are often connected. So when children miss days of school, this can quickly lead to these notable changes in sleep, right? So starting to wake up later, take daytime naps, start staying up later at night. We also know that this limited sleep, this can create challenge in terms of how we face anxiety or difficulties, right? It makes it much harder to face something that's difficult, like anxiety around school, when we have limited sleep. So this first step is always reestablishing or establishing for the first time healthy habits around sleep. So for example, if your child's at home, this might look like making sure that they get out of bed every day at the same time as a typical school schedule, even if they're not going to school. We really want to think about how to prevent any naps from happening during the day and try to limit the amount of time that your child's spending in bed or on bed during the day. There are also a couple of things to think about in terms of at night, how can we create good quality sleep in general? So first, thinking about a room that's cool, dark, hopefully quiet. Again, thinking about the bed as only an area for sleeping. So we don't want to do homework in bed. We try not to watch TV in bed. This is just for getting into bed and turning off the light to go to sleep. Winding down before bed can also be a really helpful strategy. So avoiding screens or stimulating activities, but finding instead a calm activity to transition into sleep mode. And engaging in a pre-sleep routine can also be really helpful. When we do a routine, it cues your body into what's happening next. So when we do a regular pre-sleep routine as we're getting ready for bed, can help cue the body in that it's time to slow down and get ready for sleep. So for example, whatever you're doing, we try to do it in the same order each night. You know, we eat a snack, we take a shower, put on PJs, brush teeth, maybe listen to a calming song, get into bed. Also, we want to try to avoid screens 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. If this is not the case for your child right now, because this is really hard to separate out and turn off screen time. If that's not the case, think about a way to maybe make a small gradual transition. So, you know, maybe it's just starting with limiting electronics 10 minutes before bed, and then maybe 20 minutes before bed, and then an hour. Having consistent sleep and wake times also is a really important component of good sleep hygiene. And this is even thinking about on the weekends or during upcoming vacations, thinking about how to really try to keep those sleep wake times within 30 to 60 minutes of what we would typically do during a school week. So we also know that physical activity is crucial for kids and teens' mental and physical health, right? Regular activity increases mood, it increases energy, and it improves sleep. And we also know that it helps to decrease stress levels and anxiety levels. So think about ways to get your child moving each day. Ideally, for an hour, most days is what we're going for. Get creative with riding a bike, jumping on the trampoline, walking the dog, sports. And even if your child isn't close to an hour of activity or a half hour of activity, you know, starting small again, 10 minutes a day, getting some kind of movement is really important. And then also take time to reflect on how much of the day your child's spending on digital technology right now. So what kind of boundaries in place or family rules that might help support kind of screen time limits. And then considering whether you need to make any adjustments to that, to what's happening right now with screen use for your child. So Does there need to be firmer limits around screen use? Would it be helpful to create a family media plan around when and how everyone in the family is using phones and computers? Carving out tech-free time can be really powerful, even again, if it's just 20 minutes during dinner. And then really thinking about how to model healthy boundaries for ourselves around technology use so that our kids are seeing those healthy relationships with tech use. And keeping an eye out for whether media is starting to get in the way of other important activities like sleep or exercise or family connection can be helpful for us to think about when we might need to make changes. And then lastly, in these fundamental aspects that we want to make sure are in place, we want to also teach and model how to cope with stress and anxiety. So this is through strategies such as slow, deep breathing, doing mindful art, maybe learning to take breaks and to reset. And reflect on what you do as a parent to cope, right? So do you go for a drive? Do you listen to calming music? Watch a favorite show? Really engage in these activities with your child or your teen as often as you can, helping model for them and connecting with them. You might think about other coping strategies that include things like movement, so maybe yoga or exercise like we talked about. We can do things like using our 5 senses to ground us by noticing 5 things we see around us, 4 things that we feel, 3 things we hear, 2 smells, and 1 taste. Other strategies include things like creating a coping box. So that might include things that your child or your teen that make them feel calm or make them feel happy. So for kids, it might be things like a favorite stuffed animal or a book. And for teens, it might be things like pictures of friends or a music playlist that makes them feel good. And so in addition to thinking about these fundamental aspects of your child's life that we always want to check in about and keep at that foundation, it's also crucial to reach out to your school team as soon as you start to notice warning signs. It's so much easier to prevent these problems from happening than to intervene down the road. So as soon as you start to notice those warning signs, reach out and connect and let them know what you're noticing. Folks that might be able to help support at school include teachers, administrators, counselors, social work. When we have a team together that everybody understands what's going on and how to create and support that plan, that's when we really see change that lasts. And the school will be able to determine the appropriate level of support that's needed. So they may do additional assessments, offer school counseling, develop a plan with you to get your child back to school. And they might also offer referrals for outside mental health providers. And one thing to note here is this may or may not include a formalized individual education plan, like an IEP or a 504 plan to support attendance. So if that is the case, that might be modifications like an adjusted class schedule, reduced course load. And this is typically for a shorter period of time. So the goal really is to have short-term modifications to help get the child back in school that they may not need long-term. So many times schools can actually do some of these modifications short-term without having to go through any kind of formal evaluation process through CSE. And it's also important to just loop in any providers that you are working with already outside the school. So that might be a mental health clinician or a medical health provider, maybe your pediatrician, in order to make sure that everybody on your team is there to help support and get things on track. So when we're working with the school to create a plan, the first thing that we want to do is actually step back and really determine where your child is falling on the spectrum of school avoidance behaviors. Because the level of intervention that we want to implement is really going to vary depending on the level of difficulty that they're having with that school avoidance and school anxiety, right? So on this one end of the spectrum, if your child is regularly attending school, but there's a lot of distress involved, we might start by focusing really on the fundamental aspects, right? Is sleep in place, exercise, what's their digital tech use like? How is their stress management? And we're going to focus on those things in addition to checking in with school and talking about maybe the school is providing some initial social emotional support for your child to help them feel safe and connected at school. Maybe they're doing a check-in, check-out system with a trusted adult. So that might be on one end of the spectrum. In the middle, we're going to think about interventions that might include those initial strategies, as well as starting to create a more formal plan for getting kids back to school. Now we're thinking about kids are starting to miss days. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we're still going to focus on the fundamental piece, but now we're going to also include a lot more intensive interventions. So this would likely include the support of other professionals like mental health or medical providers to help us really implement a strong plan. So once we've determined where we are on the spectrum, we really want to collaborate with the school and with your child to identify specific goals to get your child back to school, as well as those specific steps to reach those goals. While we're doing this, we really want to keep in mind that anxiety wants us to avoid the situation, right? Meaning that your child wants to avoid school at all costs. And so we need to remind ourselves and the child that slowly approaching and sitting with that anxiety is the way in which we ultimately are able to reduce and gain back that control of over anxiety. So in order to create a successful plan to get our increased attendance back at school, we really want to start with small, realistic goals. We want to meet the child where they are, right? So if they're on the end of the spectrum where they aren't going to school and haven't been in weeks, we're not going to go ahead and say, okay, goal number 1, let's get you to school for a whole week, or even let's get you to school for a whole day, right? We'd rather have a lot of very small successes and build momentum and build confidence as we decrease that anxiety, rather than a couple of big successes and then a failure, and then a success and a failure. So we think about how to start low and slow, and then we build consistently. We really want to also be aware of situations where we might have this sort of all or nothing approach, right? So if your child says, I'm not going into the building, then we say, okay, we're giving up, we're going home. Instead, we want to think about how can we still help them to overcome a little bit of that anxiety. So, okay, they're not going in the building right now. So then we're going to sit in the car in the school parking lot while that anxiety goes down. So for a moment, let's take a look at what an example plan might be for helping to increase school attendance. We start at the bottom here and we work our way up the ladder. So you can see here at the beginning, at the bottom of the ladder, we have just simple initial steps, right? So we might drive by the school, might sit in the parking lot. Eventually we're moving up to maybe we're attending school for 30 minutes without even any expectation of doing classwork. Eventually we're building to an hour, to a morning, and eventually to a full day and beyond. How quickly we move through these steps in the ladder depends on your child's progress. Typically it could be a few days as we move forward. But again, it's varied independent of your child and where they are with each step. And we might find sometimes that we have a step that is too hard and we're finding resistance and we're not having progress, and that's okay. That just tells us we need to break it down a little bit further, right? So if we can't even drive by the school, okay, maybe we're going to start by just thinking about school. We're going to look at pictures of school online. We're going to watch a video of something happening at school, or we're going to talk a lot about school during the day at home. And then we're going to keep building up from there. A key part of this process of getting kids back in school is that we also really want to have regular reinforcement for it. So we want to reward their efforts. Each time they make a step on one of those rungs of the ladder, we really want to make sure that we're rewarding or positively reinforcing them for that hard work that they're doing. So what happens though if there's a day when our child just can't get to school? Or maybe they go to school, but the plan is just to go for a couple hours right now. This is where we want to start to think a little bit about those accidental reinforcers that can sometimes happen at home. So the goal is to make home as aversive as possible. We don't want to make it something that's fun or rewarding. We want to have your child stay at home in their room. If it's free of reinforcers. If it's not, let's find a different place. So maybe a dull room, a boring room in the house. And that's where they really want them to spend most of the day. We want them completing their schoolwork. Textbooks are read, supplemental worksheets, essays are done. All components that they would be doing at school, we're making sure is completed at home. And we really want to make sure that they're not engaging in any other activities that might be fun. So even if they're finishing their schoolwork, we aren't going to allow for starting to play video games or watching TV or having fun. We want to find other things that are fairly boring and maybe additional schoolwork, additional readings, so that there's nothing that's kind of fun and exciting about being at home. There are times when consequences may also be necessary. So this is especially true in situations where a child might not necessarily be as afraid to attend school, but just kind of prefers to stay home or stay with parents. And a key thing is when we are pairing a consequence, when we have a consequence, we really want to pair that with a reward, so with an similarly sized reward for when they do attend or when they do work towards attendance at school. And then if your child is not regularly attending school, we want to make sure that we are getting them out of the house on after school hours or on the weekends, getting them to busy places like going on errands to a grocery store or other opportunities for exposure to crowds and noise. So that, again, that's kind of that cold pool idea of, if they are feeling kind of a bit anxious about being around a lot of people or in those kind of more crowded situations, we want to allow for opportunities for them to gain that exposure and get comfortable with that as they're working towards getting back to school. So another piece of this dance is that we as parents can also often get pulled into the anxiety cycle. It is really hard to see our kids distressed, right? Evolutionarily, we're supposed to react to it. We're primed to respond and to protect our kids. And at the same time, we can get really caught in this cycle, right? So our child is worried, then we become worried. We try to reassure them. Our child escalates with more worry. We become frustrated, overwhelmed, more worried ourselves. It ends up that both our child and us are upset. And then we both get to this place of being really unsure about how to handle the worry and the anxiety. And we start to maybe think, okay, maybe my child can't handle this. I'm not really sure. And we're so caught up in the cycle that we can't really step back and think about what might be best for them, what might make the most sense. So how do we respond when our child is anxious about going to school or anxious in general? And we have typically this sort of continuum of responses, right? From accountability, very firm accountability, to accommodation. And we all kind of fall somewhere on this spectrum. And, I'd love for you to think and reflect for a moment on where do you fall in this spectrum, right? Do you tend to be more on the accommodating side? Do you tend to be more on the accountability? Where might your child need you to fall? On the one hand, accountability can be helpful, right? But it also can go too far. We might start to say, like, it's not a big deal. You got to get to school. Just let it go. I thought you said you were excited. Just come on, let's go, right? Or we're going. This is not acceptable. Get in the car now. And then on the other side, accommodation can also go too far, right? We give in too much. We might start to say, you're right, this is too hard. Let's just go home. Or, okay, you can stay home today because I know it's really upsetting for you. And being on either end of the spectrum makes so much sense, right? It's easy to get pulled one direction or the other. But ideally, we want to really think about what is that sweet spot? How can we be somewhere closer to that middle where we're supportive, but we're also being firm? So how do we find that sweet spot? I wish that I knew. I do not have a magic wand, but we do have some strategies that can at least help to pull us closer to that middle ground, closer to that sweet spot that we're looking for. So the first thing that we want to try to do to get us closer to that middle ground is that we want to validate our child's feelings and offer empathetic reflection. Empathetic reflection sounds something like this. A child says, "I'm scared about going to school." And instead of saying, "Don't worry, you're fine, there's no need to be scared, you're good," we might instead say something like, "You're really worried. I understand that. Other kids worry about school too." Empathic reflection teaches kids, "I hear you. It makes sense that you're feeling that way." And we're not trying to change things. We're not trying to reassure. This really helps kids to recognize that it's okay and it's normal for them to feel that way, and that the trusted adults around them understand and hear what they're going through. The second thing we want to do is we want to communicate our confidence to the child. So even if you're feeling anxious about whether they can actually do it, we want to express outwardly that confidence. If we express doubt, they also are going to doubt it, right? They look to us. And so oftentimes this involves being ready with phrases ahead of time, because in the moment it can be really challenging to think of what to say, right? So it might sound something like, "I know this is really hard for you, and I believe you can do it." And so coming up with those phrases ahead of time, use this PowerPoint, brainstorm other ways to have that sort of support and that confidence that we're going to express in those moments that are challenging, when maybe our child is doubting their own confidence. We also want to think about what helps your child to feel calm. So is it getting up early in the morning so that they're not rushed, having things laid out the night before? Is it listening to calming music in the morning? Are they the kind of kiddo that needs a conversation to distract them? Or do they just need silence if they're going through something like this? Do they need a hug? Really think about what are some things that help them to feel calm that can set them up for success in these situations as you're working towards getting back to school. And sit down with them and think and brainstorm with them about what might be helpful for them in order to feel successful. Another key piece is that we don't want to engage anxiety in conversation. So if you've done steps 1 through 3 and you notice that you're still going back and forth and back and forth, that might be and is likely anxiety talking, right? On both ends, on child's end, on our end, that's our anxieties talking back and forth. And so we really want to pause when we notice this, maybe take a deep breath, and maybe remove ourselves from the situation for a moment if needed, or tag team out with another adult if there's someone else at home. And when we return, if we needed to take a break, we're going to try to just calmly remind our child of the plan. And then we're going to stop engaging, and we're going to they might continue to talk, and we can say, but we're not going to engage. We're not going to go back and forth with that anxiety in conversation. We can be a supportive presence without fueling that anxiety fire. And then lastly, we really want to try to stay firm with our plan. This can be challenging, but kids and teens really need the supportive but firm response in order to keep them moving forward and to show them that we know that they can do it. And we really want to remember that the goal here isn't to eliminate anxiety. It's just to help make it manageable. Everybody experiences anxiety, but we want to bring it down to a level where it's not taking control of our lives. And then importantly, this is the thing that always gets pushed to the side, right? But it's really important as parents to take care of ourselves. It's not a me first, but a me too, right? Are your basic needs being met? Are you finding ways to maybe be able to express your feelings, get them out so that they're not pent up inside? Maybe be aware of what your self-talk is. Is your self-talk fueling that fire, or is it helping to put it out? Are there ways to focus on helpful or realistic thoughts? Like, I'm doing the best I can, or my family is strong, we can get through this. And then think about, what other supports do we need? Do you need formal supports? Do you need informal supports? So from friends or family or professionals. And then are there small things we can do each day to start to make a little bit of change in keeping your body and your brain calm and feeling in a good space to be able to then support your child through these challenging times? And then there might also come a point where we want more additional support to be able to help get your child back to school. So some signals that we might want formal support would include things like noticing this sort of constant or severe impairment on a daily basis in your child's life. So really impairing academic performance or other things related to school, getting in the way of friendships, family life. If you're starting to notice that your family is like living around anxiety or around the behavior problems related to anxiety, that's a signal that we want to get some more support. If you notice there's sort of a long list of things that you or your child's avoiding and it keeps growing, or if you're noticing that your family or your child is experiencing significant distress, these are all signals that it'd be important to get more additional formal support. So what kind of support is out there? Connecting with a mental health clinician for therapy for your child or your family is a really helpful and important next step. So mental health clinicians can help with creating and supporting that attendance plan to get your child back at school. They can make sure that goals are appropriately sized, that there isn't something like incidentally reinforcing that non-attendance at home. Clinicians can also help with managing anxiety or other mental health challenges that might be applicable as well. And then it can be helpful sometimes to consider medication management, and that would be with connecting with a pediatrician or a psychiatrist around mental health challenges that might be related to some of these school avoidance behaviors that we're seeing. So anxiety or depression, sometimes comorbid with ADHD. And then you can consider other supports, for example, like a special education advocate through programs such as Starbridge. And then I want to just mention a couple, and we'll send along the PowerPoint so that you all can look at this in more detail because I want to leave time for questions. But there are a number of different outpatient therapy services within our community, and you'll see those listed here. There are also private practice options. And so I recommend often when you're looking for therapy, get on multiple wait lists. So think about reaching out to the variety of outpatient options that are on the slide prior, but also connect with different private practice options. You can contact your insurance for paneled therapists as well. And you can consider asking for referrals from your primary care provider, from your school team, from friends or family. And then if you need quicker access because maybe your child is experiencing more immediate concerns, there are walk-in options at Rochester Regional or Genesee Mental Health, Catholic Family Center. There are a number of different helplines that you can take a look at on here. And then if your child is experiencing a crisis and really needs immediate support and there's concern for safety for themselves or others, mobile crisis teams are a really good first step as long as they're not in immediate life-threatening concern, or the emergency department, of course, if there is a more immediate concern for harm to themselves or others. And I'll leave that all in there. There are a couple other additional resources here that I won't go through in detail so we can have time for questions, but you can take a look at those. I'll make sure to connect those with Linda. And so lastly, just want to say thank you so much to everybody for being here. And I'd love to be able to take a few questions and get a chance to talk with you all. Thank you.